This episode is sponsored by Kendo UI. Kendo UI allows you to build better apps faster. They have a comprehensive library ranging from data grids and charts to buttons and sliders. Plus, you can use their components as plain JavaScript as well as in Angular, React, and Vue. They have a large collection of customizable popular themes like Bootstrap and Material. Go check them out at reactroundup.com/KendoUI. Hey everybody, and welcome to another React Roundup. This week on our panel, we have Lukasz Heisz.
Hello, everybody.
Justin Bennett.
Hey, folks.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. I just want to quickly announce, I know that we're like 5 weeks ahead, so it'll probably be well on its way by the time you get this, but I'm starting a new show. It's just going to be me with the occasional guest. I'm going to try and post every day, and I'm basically going to be talking about developer freedom, so freedom in your career, freedom in your job, how to create more of that where you work, or find a job that actually will provide you whatever freedom you want, and talk about the different kinds of freedom. So freedom, if it means to you basically that I go home at 5 o'clock and hang out with my family, or freedom where it's I wish I had more time to work on open source or learn new things, or whatever that is for you. So we're going to talk about all of that stuff, and I'm really excited to get it going. We're recording this at the beginning of November, and I'm hoping to get it launched here within the next week or so. So anyway,
Chuck, what if I want all of those freedoms you said?
We'll talk about all of it. We're here to talk to Kent about testing today. We're not here to talk to Chuck about freedom. So
okay.
We have a special guest this week, and that's Kent C. Dodds.
Hey there.
Now, you were on the show for a while when we started it, and then, got busy. People get busy.
Yeah, that happens.
You want to fill us in on what you've been doing since?
Yeah. So I guess it's been a couple months. So my name is Kent C. Dodds. I'm a software engineer for PayPal. I do JavaScript full stack, mostly focused on front end and tools. I do spend a little bit of time on the server, but servers never were really super interesting to me. And so I spend most of my time in React and tooling related Node stuff. So that's what I'm all about. I'm for those who don't know me, I'm pretty prolific in open source. I do have created several open source projects that you have probably heard of if not used. Probably the biggest one is Cross ENV. That's one that people are constantly surprised that I'm the author of that one, but lots of people use that. And I'm an instructor. I just released a huge course about testing, testingjavascript.com. You can check that out. People seem to be pretty happy with that. And I'm on Egghead.io, Front-End Masters, and through Front-End Masters, I'm on Pluralsight. So I do a lot of teaching and a lot of open source. And then I've got a family. I'm married and 4 kids and a dog. And so pretty busy stuff going on in my life.
Nice.
The 4 kids part is impressive.
I think it's mostly impressive. That's mostly thanks to my wife. I don't do a whole lot to make that happen, but it's pretty awesome.
I'm trying to convince my wife to get the dog. Then we'll have you beat because we have 5 kids.
Ooh, yeah. No, you still have me beat. Dogs are a bit of work, but not as much as a kid. So our oldest is 6, and we decided to get a dog anyway. I don't even know what we were thinking.
You have 4 kids, 6 and under. You've got it rougher than me. We just got back from a family vacation. It was a cruise, and those are supposed to be really relaxing and stuff. And nope, not with 4 kids, 6 and under. Nope. Yeah, awesome. Well, let's talk about testing. I think Lukasz had some ideas as far as where he wanted to start. So let's just jump in and start talking about testing React.
Yeah. So Kent, first, 7 years ago, we were all talking about we need tests. We were 10 years ago having these projects that had no tests at all in the UI. The UI was getting more complicated. And today, we are thinking about how to write better tests, right? It's like the next step on that subject. So you've been talking about ideas of maybe we have 2 types of tests that are testing implementation details, tests that are not. One is good, one is bad. So what's your story with tests? What sparked these ideas?
Yeah, that's a good insight. I actually wasn't around the software world 7 years ago, but it does make sense that we, as a software industry, we kind of we're building solutions, and then we find out that hey, it's really annoying to to ship a change and things break. And so let's go ahead and we'll verify things before we ship stuff. And then we realize, oh, like this is pretty arduous. Let's automate some of this. And so now we're testing, and some of these tests are better than others. And so now we're trying to improve our testing. So I guess I came around about the time that, at least in the front end world, most people were starting to realize that testing was a good idea. I think it's been pretty recent that like lots of people were like, yeah, why would you test your JavaScript? It's like 200 lines of code. Like that's, a waste of time. But now it's 200,000 lines of code, 2 million lines of code. Like we've got pretty intense business logic going on in our front ends, and breaking things in the front end can break entire experiences and ruin people's experience using your application. So I got in when people were just starting to think, hey, it's probably a good idea that we test this JavaScript stuff. And one person that really was my first introduction into testing JavaScript is Joe Eames, who people should probably be familiar with. He was actually one of the organizers of ReactConf, and he's very involved in the dev community, and he's really heavily into testing. He was finding a losing battle at the company we were at. Nobody was really interested in testing, but I was, brand new developer at the time. This was 4 years ago, and he just took me under his wing and taught me testing. And I thought it was cool, but it never really got into my workflow until I started doing a lot of open source and realizing that it was annoying to have to go through and manually check things before I release or deal with broken things when I released. And so I started testing, and that was really where it came from for me. Was I said, you know what, I really don't like having to manually check things before I release. And so I'll automate some of that process. And then once I kind of tasted the fruit of those labors, it just became a totally natural thing for me. All of my open source projects are 100% covered with tests, and I often don't need to do any more than run the tests before I make a release. And that feels pretty safe for me. It helps me sleep at night. So that's how I got into testing.
Okay, so here at my work, one thing that happened is like, whoa, we have a bunch of tests. We're super well tested. The sentence, the quote, there's no such thing as too many tests, were being said a lot.
I love that. Test on all.
Yes. And then we were realizing that like every change we made, we were breaking 7, 8, 9 tests. And then people were like, start to talk about unit tests as like this cumbersome thing that is always making me mad. And I started noticing that this was probably like a bad cultural shift of like tests are this helpful thing to test is like something cumbersome. And I also felt that it was not providing the feedback that we needed. Like we need to refactor something, and it's like, it's everything we change breaks stuff. So how do I know this suite of tests is actually helping me? So how did it work? How did it happen at PayPal? How was the process there? And how did you start thinking about those things?
Lucas, that resonates so perfectly. That I think that's a really valuable insight. I remember writing tests early on and thinking, I feel like I'm just rewriting my code in my test.
Exactly.
I'm copy pasting some logic and stuff into my test. Like what is this even doing? And every single time you touch the source code, the tests are breaking. And so you're thinking, okay, so what am I verifying? That all that my tests are verifying is that I haven't touched the source code. And so that's not helping me at all. So yeah, the reason this happens, and you're right, Lucas, it's a really dangerous shift. We spend all of this effort and time thinking, like trying to convince people, hey, we need to test. Like this is really important. And then they do it. They're like, yeah, okay, this feels good. It's a nice workflow, whatever. And then all this happens, and they're like, no, testing is worthless. And they go back even more sure that their testing is not worth the effort. So the reason this is happening is because in testing, you wind up with 2 scenarios if you do it incorrectly. And it's really easy to do incorrectly. So one scenario is you have a false negative where a test is failing, but the application is working. And that leads to the really frustrating experience that we're talking about here, where it's like, yeah, my test isn't doing any good for me. It's just slowing me down. So that's the false negative case. And then you have the false positive, where the test is passing, but you actually broke broke the app. So you're not ensuring that the user's experience using your app is going to work. You're just testing that your test is working. So it doesn't provide you any level of confidence. In fact, I would suggest that those tests are those kinds of tests that lead to false negatives and false positives are actually worse than having no test at all, because it slows you down and it makes you feel like you're confident when you actually aren't. So you'll go ahead and release stuff because the tests are passing, but the application's actually broken. And I think that the big secret to being a happy and successful tester is being able to look at your test suite, or to avoid those false negatives and false positives in your test suite. And that's kind of the secret that I teach about in my blog posts and in my open source libraries, in testingjavascript.com. That's the key nugget that I think a lot of people are missing, and I'm trying to fill that hole in all of the stuff that I do.
So what is the makeup of a good test? What should you be testing, and what should you avoid testing?
Nothing.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Test everything, all the things, every line. No.
When I started programming, I got indoctrinated that way, right? 100% test coverage, cover everything, look at everything. You need to test on everything. And some of that stuff, it was like, I don't even know where to start, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we can talk about 100% code coverage later, because I've got some thoughts about that. But yeah, so how do you avoid those false negatives and false positives? So if you take a step back and let's think about this from the perspective of, like, from the very beginning. We don't have any tests at all. We've never automated any testing. The idea of automation is not even, like, hasn't been invented yet. So what are we going to do? Well, before, like, we've made a change, we're going to ship it to production, but before we do that, we're going to manually walk through a series of steps to make sure that things are working. So we'll click on the label, or the input that's labeled username. We'll type in a fake username that we have in the database or whatever. Then we'll find the password field, we'll type in the password, and then we'll find the submit button, we'll hit submit, and then we'll verify that we have been successfully logged in, our username's displayed somewhere, whatever. And so this is the experience that the user is looking for. This is how we know that our software is working. And if your test is doing anything other than that, then you're not getting the confidence that that is going to work. You're just getting the confidence that what your test is doing is going to work, which is fine. Maybe, like, there's some sort of correlation there. But if you can get your test to be, your automated test to be as close as possible to that experience that you're trying to verify, then you can get a lot more confidence that it's going to work. And when you break something, your test should break as well. And so the quote that I say regularly, it's one that I made up myself, so I'm quoting myself, but it is that the more your tests resemble the way that your software is used, the more confidence they can give you. And that's my guiding principle for how I write tests. That's the guiding principle for my libraries. Is my libraries should give you utilities to make your tests resemble the way that your software is being used. So one thing that I see a lot, like, if we're going to talk specific examples, one thing that I see a lot is people who are using a tool like Enzyme. They'll render a component, and then, or they'll mount it or whatever, and then they'll get the instance of that class that they've mounted, the class of that component, and they'll call methods on it. They'll verify that its state is being updated correctly. They'll interact with it in a way that's totally different from the way that regular users will use that component. So if we think about automated testing of our React components, we should consider who are the users of this component. There's the end users who are going to be looking for username and type that in, password, type that in, and then submit button. And then there's the developer user who's going to render that login form. And so they're going to be passing an on login, submit, or whatever click handler. So our test should be using that component in the same way and not do anything that our two users could or would generally do. So our developer user isn't going to get the instance and call methods on it. They're going to render it with this callback, and then our end user is going to be clicking around and filling things in and then clicking the submit button. And then the developer user is going to do something with that click handler, right? So the mistake I see a lot, people rendering something and then mucking around with the instance, that basically is saying now my source code has three users. It has the end user, the developer user, and the test user. And so now, like before, when it was in my application code, I was just concerned about the developer user and the end user. And if my test starts using it in a different way, now I have to also be concerned about the test user. And I don't really like, the end user doesn't care about the test user. The developer who's using the component doesn't care about the test user. So your test exists for itself in that scenario. And so we avoid this by using tools that allow us, or using tools in a way that resemble the way our software is used. So we get rid of that test user that nobody cares about and focus only on the developer user and the end user. Does that make sense?
For sure. So in both of these cases, the end user is going to be like more of an integration test. It's going to be like walking through user flow and like driving that. And the developer user, is that going to map up more to like what a unit test would be, making sure that it like takes the right things and reacts in expected ways in the isolated context that a developer would use it? Is that kind of how you look at it?
Yeah, that's a good question, Justin. So I actually don't care too much for the distinctions between integration and unit tests. If I really look at the tests that I've written and think hard about what qualifies for each type, then I definitely spend a lot more time in the integration test scenario. Most of my like purely unit tests are of regular functions that are pure functions. They return values. I give them values, they return values the same every time. Those are really easy to write. I love writing those. I have complex logic. I'm going to stick it in a module like that and I'll test it that way. But for my React components, most of the time, those are going to be integration tests. And I'm going to be doing that in a way that resembles the way that the software is being used. So I'll render the component to the DOM, and I will I'll find the username input by its label, because that's how the user is going to find it. I'll find the password input by its label. Often I'll see people say, okay, I find all the inputs. The first input we'll put in the username. The second input we'll put in the password. And then that breaks because we change the order, or because we add a checkbox at the beginning, or for whatever reason. But that wouldn't break the user. If we were manually testing this, that wouldn't break the user's experience. And so it shouldn't break your test either. So React Testing Library has these queries that allow you to get a labeled input in the way that a user would. They just look for the label text. And so anyway, I think I'm kind of drifted away from what you're asking about. But the general idea is I care less about the type of test I'm writing and more about the type of confidence that I'm getting out of my test, and more about use cases. I think one mistake that we get a lot of times is we look at a React component, we see the component did update lifecycle method, and we think, I need to test this component did update lifecycle method. And what we should be asking ourselves is, what are the use cases this thing supports? If I re-render it with a new URL, then it should go refetch that URL, or whatever the case may be. And so we should be testing use cases and not code. And code coverage is a metric to show us, to help us find the use cases that we're missing, or find code that actually shouldn't be there at all because we don't have that use case anymore, or we never needed that code in the first place. But yeah, focusing on use cases, not code, and not worrying so much about whether or not your test is integration or unit. That's worked out really well for me and the teams that I've worked on. And so hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, for sure. So I have worked a lot in testing in the past. I actually helped maintain a Selenium binding for Robot Framework back in the day, which is a integration testing tool. And one of the big things that, following a user's flow with testing is it can often be difficult for a variety of reasons. One is if you're using a tool like Selenium, you don't have as much application level knowledge, and there's a lot of timing things. When are things going to render? When are things going to be available? So I guess React Testing Library is going to alleviate a lot of those problems. But are you still testing things a little bit in isolation? So you're only testing this top level component that contains this flow, or are you trying to kind of mount this whole app and test a flow in the app?
That's a really great question. So generally, it kind of depends. I have a kind of a combination of both of these things. But when I'm talking about UI integration testing, I am still mocking the backend. And so whether or not I'm rendering a higher level component that renders a bunch of components, so an entire page or something, or one specific component, I'm not going to be making HTTP calls. I'll also generally mock animation libraries so that I don't have to wait for a full second before the DOM node is actually removed or, whatever. But those are pretty much the only things that I generally will mock is things that make HTTP calls. And also there are things like browser APIs that aren't implemented in JS DOM or are really hard to kind of simulate the position of this element or whatever. Generally, I'll make a module that interacts with those browser APIs and mock that module, or I'll create my own mock globally or something. Those are kind of hard to test in JS DOM. And if I really need that confidence, I'll probably move that to a test in Cypress or something. But for the most part, I can do things in JS DOM. But yeah, aside from those things, I'm going to be rendering the whole component, and it kind of depends on what I'm trying, the use case that I'm trying to get out of my test. I definitely have some tests that will let's take this page, we'll render the whole page, and then click around and interact with it the way that the user would. I have other tests where I'll start at the app component, I'll render the whole app, and then I'll click around and things. Those are starting to get into the realm of the end-to-end testing that I do. But end-to-end testing for me is more kind of exploratory, like let's pretend we really are a user and we're going to do many things. So end-to-end tests for me generally tend to be quite long. And it's just a series of, like this flow that a typical user would do. They'll log in, they'll click on this, they'll add this to the cart, they'll remove this from the cart, lots and lots of different actions. Integration test is a little less of that, but it still does have multiple pieces to it. And then the unit test will be, hey, there's this weird edge case, or there's this really complicated function. I want to make sure that I'm covering all of those things. Integration tests will also get into edge cases of my components and things like, given that I can get into this state, I'm not going to allow the user to do this thing or whatever. So it kind of ebbs and flows. It depends on really what I'm looking to get out of my tests. Generally, if I were to take a inventory of the tests in my applications, I have a handful of end-to-end tests that are going to be behaving the way that a typical user would, like in reality in my application. And then I'll have a whole bunch of integration tests, but just a few of those will render a really big component that renders many other components. Most of those are going to be, my card component or maybe a form, but they're going to render the full tree below them. And then I'll have a handful of unit tests for all of my more complicated logic. I hope that kind of answers your question there.
Yeah, for sure.
One thing I'm curious about, you're talking about all these different sort of levels, and I have a few of these, and I have a few more of these, and a lot of these, especially on end-to-end tests. I find that those are rather expensive to write and run. Some of the integration ones will be as well as if you're rendering, like you said, massive components that render a bunch of other components. A lot of that can get expensive as far as the time it takes to run the tests. One thing that I'm curious about is where do you decide, okay, these are expensive, so I don't want to do too many of them, but at what point is it worth it to do one of those, like an end-to-end test or an integration test at some level?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chuck. So lots of people are familiar with the testing pyramid, where at the base of the pyramid you have unit, then in the middle you have integration, and at the top you have end-to-end. And so the idea is that you have more unit, then a little fewer integration, and then even fewer end-to-end. And there are two arguments for why your test should be kind of shaped that way, or your focus should be shaped that way. The one argument is the higher up the pyramid you go, the more expensive it is to write, run, and wait for those tests to actually work. They're also more finicky the higher up the pyramid you go, and so they're just kind of frustrating. That's pretty much it. It's like they cost more and they take longer. But the one thing that always rubbed me wrong about the testing pyramid is that it ignores this thing that I call the testing confidence coefficient. So the higher up the pyramid you go, the more confidence those tests are going to give you. And the reason for that is pretty simple. It's just that the higher up the pyramid you go, the more real world experience you're testing. So you're getting closer and closer to your test resembling the way that the software is used, right? So end-to-end test level, that's right down to not the entire application is an implementation detail, and we're just using this exactly like a user would, which is a great thing. And so, yeah, I saw the testing pyramid and I said, yeah, that's interesting, but what about the confidence coefficient? If it gets more expensive and takes longer to run, the higher up the pyramid I go, then why don't I just spend 100% of my time in unit tests at the bottom? Like, they're faster and they don't take as long and they don't cost as much. Like, I should spend all of my time writing those tests. But that's the reason for spending more time higher up the pyramid, is because there's the confidence coefficient. Maybe like 10 years ago, this was true and the pyramid worked really well. But our tools today are much better. And so we can afford to spend more time with tests that are giving us more confidence. For example, one thing that people often complain about with integration and end-to-end tests is that because your tests include the concerns of a lot of different components of your application, there are more points of failure. And so when something does fail, like there's a bug in one little component that's being used in like 30 tests, you're going to have all 30 of your tests fail. And you're like, okay, so what on earth is broken here? And back in the day when our tools weren't all that great, that I can see how that could be very frustrating, like spending hours trying to figure out, okay, looking at all the tests error output and thinking, what on earth, there's something in here that's busted and I don't know what it is. So I can see how that could be really frustrating. But now our tools, they'll show us like the line that threw the error. They'll show us like the code that that is causing the problem. In Cypress, it'll like you can literally look at the browser and step through and see DOM snapshots, interact with the DOM at any point, any assertion in that tool. So it's actually remarkably easy to find out which one of these things broke. Now, it is still kind of surprising and abrupt to see like 30 test failures, but you just take a second, calm down, and then actually look at the output. It doesn't take that long to identify what the problem is. And so, yeah, having multiple assertions in a single test, that used to be something that people say, no, don't ever do that. It's a bad idea. These days, our tools are good enough that, yeah, sure, you throw as many assertions in there as you like, because we're going to show you like in the terminal or whatever, here's the code. This is the line right here. You don't even have to pull up the file. You can see the code right in the error. So it like throw as many assertions in there as you want. As you need to get the confidence you're looking for. So I care a little bit less about like how long is this test going to take, like especially with UI integration tests, where even if I render the whole page, if that's making my test take too long, then my application probably has a performance problem. And so I should deal with that performance problem. Like if it takes a full second to render my application, then I wonder what it's going to do when I send that to my user and they're waiting for a full second for my application in a JavaScript just to render. Like, yeah, that's a performance problem. And so you need to fix that. So typically I've found that my integration tests definitely do take longer than my unit tests. Like there's no doubt about it. But the confidence coefficient for an integration test is just makes that difference so insignificant that I don't even think about it. Unless there really is a performance problem, then I go and deal with that. So anyway, hopefully check that kind of helps address what you were asking about.
It does. The other thing that I'm going to ask then is why do you care about confidence? I mean, we're talking about the code working and my boss not getting mad at me, right? So what is confidence and why does it matter? What does it give me that's going to matter in the long term on anything else related to this project?
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
Yeah, sure. So I think that confidence in your code it depends on what you're really looking for. So like some projects are just like, hey, this is a prototype, just throw it out there, like get it out. I wouldn't test anything in there. Like some people have integrated testing so much into their workflow that it actually makes them faster to write tests. And there are certain things where that's true for me. And that's where test-driven development comes in really handy and stuff. Other things are less like that. But for most people building applications and shipping to production, they want two things. They want to make sure that they never actually ship something to production that's broken, and they also want to be able to deliver features faster. That's probably true for 90% of developers out there. Is their higher ups are wanting them to be able to ship things faster, and so testing to them looks like kind of a waste of time, because like, why aren't you working on features? Why are you spending all this time on testing? In the long term, though, testing is going to make you faster, because you'll spend less time dealing with bugs that you shipped to production because you had no confidence that your application was working the way that the user wanted it to, or like the way that it should. And so you spend a lot more time fixing those bugs that you ship to production and dealing with production issues. And then like as you make changes and even if you don't ship those things to production, you have to change your context from this feature that you're working on to this bug that you ship to stage or whatever. So having those tests in place allow you to really quickly, like, I'm adding this feature, I've got a bunch of tests around it, they're all passing because I literally just wrote it right now, so that's fine. And now I'm going to go and commit. It'll run all of my tests, or that happens in CI before the pull request is even merged. I see that I actually broke some unrelated thing, or something I thought was unrelated in this other area of the code base. So my mind is still like within the context of this work, and I can go and fix that before I even send it off. So it takes a little while to get there, and especially if you can work it into your workflow, that takes a while. But once you've got it, then it really speeds you up. Mm-hmm. And that level of confidence is going to make your users a lot happier as well.
Yeah, I believe like anytime you do like a real world application, you will really quickly reach that stage where if you don't have like these guardrails, like in different parts of your application, I can only see like small prototypes not making fast. So I have another thing to talk about when you talk about the pyramid. I believe it also came from a time that the type of tests that we did were super related to the tooling that we would use for each test. So it was like, unit tests are like Mocha Chai tests, and integration tests are Selenium tests. So I believe that the cost was very related to how difficult it is to write tests and make them work in these different tools, which mm-hmm. is not the same thing as what the test is actually doing. So today, I believe that with the JS DOM and Cypress, we are making it independent, the tooling and the type of test that we are writing. So we can still write integration tests in JS DOM being run by Jest, and they're pretty fast. So this cost, the cost will be much lower than before when we were we were only able to run like Selenium tests for these interaction parts. So this is another, like today, most of our tests here will be called integration tests if you look at them today, but they are mostly being run on Jest with JS DOM, and they're not expensive.
Yeah, I think that's a valuable insight. And it's actually my dissatisfaction with the testing pyramid and the fact that it's outdated led me to create a new variant, my own variant I call the testing trophy. It does have unit integration and end-to-end, and integration is the bulk of this trophy. But I added something that wasn't in the testing pyramid, which I think is also quite valuable, and it's static code analysis. So static testing, using tools like Flow or TypeScript as a static type checker, and ESLint for your linting, and then even Prettier for your formatting, because Prettier will reveal things in your code that are hidden bugs as it's formatting things. And so like you can get a lot of, like you eliminate an entire category of problems by using these static code analysis tools. And so like I totally consider those an important part of any well-tested quality application. And then you have your unit test that's kind of sits on top of that base, and then integration tests are bigger, and then the top of your trophy is the end-to-end, which is, again, just kind of like, let's use this application. I normally only have a few of those that are like happy path, does a lot of things, use the application the way that the user will. And that's proven to work out really well for me. And I feel like it reflects better the confidence that we can gain from these different levels of isolation and focus. And then our tools have kind of enabled this. I feel like there's still a little bit more room on the end-to-end tooling area. Cypress is really, really good. And I feel like it can improve, and we could spend a little bit more time in the end-to-end tests. But I feel pretty confident with the level of and where my tests are on that testing trophy.
I have a question on this. Back when I was a new developer, I was still learning to tie my shoes. And one of the things that people kept talking about was using tests to actually track down bugs. So, a bug comes up in production, and if it's something that I can fix easily, at a minimum, I put a unit test in to make sure that it doesn't come up again, right? And I think that's generally good practice. But what if it's a hairy bug? Do you ever create like end-to-end tests that'll run through the scenario to see if you can find it? Or do you generally do it some other way?
Yeah, that's insightful. If you can, so there's this methodical approach that I haven't executed myself a whole lot, but it seems to make sense to me, where you, like, when you get a bug like this, generally the QA engineer or whoever it was that reported it will give you a step-by-step instructions on how to reproduce this. If you can take that and turn it into an end-to-end test that you can run and reveal this bug, then that's really helpful. In the process of doing that, you might be able to find, a subset of these instructions will actually reproduce this bug. And I maybe I don't even need to render the whole application. Maybe I can just render this one page or this one component. So you change that end-to-end test into an integration test, and then you find, that a subset of this could actually reproduce this bug, and you whittle it down to a unit test. So I think that's probably like that to me feels like a really good process to go about making sure that this thing doesn't happen again. Sometimes things happen that like you never would have had a test for, and it doesn't really make sense to have a test for it anyway. Like one example of this that's actually pretty embarrassing is the testing javascript.com I didn't actually build the website. I just made the content. The Egghead team built the website, and they used Gatsby, which is a fantastic, phenomenal framework for building static sites. The default starter for Gatsby includes a plugin for offline mode. So it'll download all the assets, and in a service worker, you load the site offline and it works. It wouldn't download all the videos and stuff. That would be like, we don't have room for that. But yeah, it'll download all the assets and things. So there was a bug in a dependency of a dependency of a dependency that basically made it so that if you direct to the page with a status code of 301, and then it will store the index HTML in the service worker with its content type set to plain text. And so the next time you come to the page, you're just going to see a wall of HTML text. And then it's stored in there forever because it doesn't render, so you will never get a new service worker loaded in. So like it's a nightmare of a bug. Like there are still people who have this service worker installed in their browser, and they're like, I get messages regularly like, "Hey, your website's busted," and I say, "Yeah, clear the service worker, try another browser, whatever." So I would never write a test for something like that. Not a high level one to say, "Hey, my service worker isn't making people see HTML." Like who would think to write a test like that, right? So there are some things that you can never plan for, and some things even now that I don't think I would ever, like, you solve that bug once, you fix that bug once, and now, and I'm sure that dependency, further down, they probably wrote a test to make sure that bug won't happen again. But there are just so many things that can enter into your application that wind up causing problems that you would never think to write a test for. And even if that bug surfaced, like I can't even imagine writing a test case for a scenario like that. Yeah, you kind of have to weigh the trade-offs of like, does it make sense to have a test like this? But long story short, I think in general, if you can write a test for a bug that you found, I actually, lots of my projects I'll have the test files, and one file will be called bugs.js. And that's where I just put all the tests for bugs that have been found. And we just make sure those never happen again.
Right.
Awesome. So can we talk about the React testing library a little bit? So
We
at my
needed
job,
another one of those.
yeah. At my job, we use Enzyme pretty heavily, and I've definitely felt some pain points on it. Particularly, just like going through the README of this project, one of the things that you highlighted is like Enzyme really almost gives you too many tools to be able to test the implementation details of a component. And I've seen that a lot where we're really diving in and testing something very specific inside of that component. And then often, you go back and you refactor or something changes, something happens, and then that test no longer works or no longer makes sense, or it's asserting something that isn't valuable. And those, it's always, I feel like that affects the confidence that you as a developer have about your tests. Like rolling back to what we started this conversation with is like part of the confidence of the tests we write are like, will they work? Will they stand up over time? So how does React Testing Library kind of aim to solve that?
Yeah. So React Testing Library, I'd been using Enzyme like everybody else about a year ago or the beginning of this year. And I was preparing a workshop to teach people testing. And the way that I teach is I really like, if people are coming to my workshop, they're coming so that they can level up their game on whatever the subject is. And so to do that, I think it's really important to teach them fundamentals and teach them how their abstractions work. So if I'm going to teach them Enzyme, I'm not going to start by teaching them Enzyme. I'm going to start by teaching them what Enzyme does when you call the mount function. And so I started with just a regular React DOM.render. Here's our component. Here's a div that we just created out of thin air. And then we can interact with that that way, which is what Enzyme does. It does a whole lot of other things, but fundamentally, that's all that it's really doing when you call mount. And I don't use shallow rendering. I have a blog post about that. I never use shallow rendering. I used it one time long enough for me to realize that all that it does is let you test implementation details. I wanted nothing to do with that. So I don't do shallow. I sometimes would do render, but I pretty much always did mount. So that's what I was teaching. And in the process of doing that, I realized I am going to have this whole 10 minutes that I'm showing them the list of Enzyme methods. And I'm going to say, don't use this, don't use this, don't use this, don't use this, use this, don't use this, don't use this. Because here we have an instance method, so you can get the instance of the class. You have this find method where you can pass a class display name and find a component by its display name. None of those things, your end users don't know or care about that. In fact, to your end users, React is an implementation detail. Divs are an implementation detail. The user doesn't care about these things. And so I just felt really uncomfortable preparing this workshop to teach people a tool where they can only use a subset. And I was like, maybe I should write an ESLint plugin that checks for whether they're using these things and warns them to not to. And it was frustrating. And I knew that Enzyme, if you look in the issue comments and things, they are heavily invested in these APIs. So I knew I couldn't make any headway in trying to make a change. So I decided I'll make my own, and one that doesn't have a list of things that you shouldn't use, and that doesn't allow you to test implementation details easily. You still can. Enzyme allows you to test implementation details. It's not magic. There is code under there, and you can write that code yourself. So it's still possible for you to test implementation details with React Testing Library. There are some situations where that's the best way to do what you're trying to do, but most of the time, I didn't want my library to make that easy. And so we kind of have an increased pit of success. So what React Testing Library allows you to do is, I really wanted to focus on this idea that the more your tests resemble the way your software is used, the more confidence they can give you. And so rather than saying, hey, let me go find this component that renders my input and I'll pass it some props, I'll set its state, I'll do whatever. Or rather than saying, okay, find me all of the inputs on this page and interact with each one in turn. The first one's going to be the username. I know that. I wanted to say, how does a user test this code? How would a user manually run through and test this? They're going to find the username field, and they know that it's a username field because it's labeled username. Blind users will do this exact same thing. They're using a screen reader. They're going to find the username field because it's labeled username. And so I was able to write a utility that finds the input field by the label text username. You can use regex, so you can use a string, you can even pass a function that returns true. Like it'll just give you all the labels and you return true for the one that you're looking for. But doing that had a really awesome effect. And I should probably mention as well, I started out with a lot simpler idea where anything you wanted to select, you'd have to give an attribute called data test ID. And then you can select that. I feel like those are a lot more resilient than using class names, which lots of people use, because class names can change because we use those for styling. And so you break your test because you're changing your class name. That's dumb. So I use test IDs. Then somebody suggested that I start doing, get by text and label and stuff. I wanted to make sure I mentioned that. That wasn't my idea. So yeah, anyway, I built that in. And now when you look at your test, what you're going to see is, okay, so we render this. That's the one part of our test that is implementation detail specific. We're rendering a React component. Our developer is a user, and so this is how they're going to use it. But the rest of our test, totally free of implementation details, including React. So we're going to, we'll get by label text username, we'll fire a change event on that, and we'll set its value, or we'll just manually set the value to check. And then we'll get by label text password, set its value to I need no password because I'm Chuck Norris. And then we'll go get by text submit, and we'll fire an event called click, and we'll click on that submit button. And then for the developer user's benefit, we'll verify that our callback was called properly, and make that assertion that it was called with the username and password. So now your test reads exactly almost like instructions that you'd give to a manual tester. Whereas with tools like Enzyme, the instructions that your test is showing are things that a user could never possibly accomplish. So anyway, that's kind of where React Testing Library came from. Like 2 weeks after I released it, I started teaching it to people in workshops and really hoping that it worked out. So I wasn't teaching people to use the library. That didn't go anywhere. Turns out it worked really well, and people seem to be pretty happy with React Testing Library. And now I extracted all these queries from React Testing Library into DOM Testing Library because I realized this is all these queries are totally implementation details free. And so now we have Vue Testing Library, there's Cypress Testing Library, I think there's one for Angular. I think somebody is using one in an Ember thing. I made one just for fun for Backbone and all kinds of these different frameworks because it's totally free of implementation detail, which makes your tests a lot more resilient to change. Like we're all excited about React hooks coming up. We don't have to change anything about our tests because they don't care about hooks. They just render components. Which is pretty cool.
So I've got a few more questions. One, so when you're getting something, when you're testing and grabbing like a label by its text, have you found that to be sort of fragile? I think back of my like jQuery development days where I took this really hard line of always make your hooks and dependencies explicit, right? So if you were like attaching jQuery functionality to a DOM element, you should be able to look at the DOM element and know because it had like a separate attribute or something that you're attaching extra functionality. And my instinct tells me that I'd want to have the same sort of thing with a test. It's like make it visible to the developer that this thing is under test. But I can see the point is like from the user's perspective, they would just see the text. So like running the test in that way might make sense. But have you found that to be like relatively stable? Is it easy to like know when you change that label that it'll like the test will fail or whatever?
Yeah, Justin, this is a pretty common criticism of relying on content because lots of developers actually don't have anything to do with content. They just use translation keys and things, and the content editors can come around later and change content wildly, which is one of the reasons why, I should say first, there's an escape hatch for this. And so if content just isn't going to work for you at all, then you can use get by test ID. That works pretty well. I'm the same as you, Justin. I want the fact that I'm testing this thing to be explicit. And so rather than relying on a class name of, button primary, we change that to button secondary. Now my test is broken. Like that's silly. So yeah, we use data test ID attributes, and people are worried about shipping those to production. You should, because then you can run automation in production too, which is good. But if you don't want to, there are Babel plugins you can use to remove those things. But yeah, so I would generally tend to avoid doing that, because you're testing or you're changing your source code for the sake of the tests, which I think is not altogether wise. So what you can do if you're worried about content changing is make your selector for that label text as generic but specific as possible, if that makes sense. So rather than being case sensitive and it has to be the string username, maybe the content editors come later and say change it to be your username, and so now your test is broken. So instead, make it case insensitive, and make it not match the whole string, just a regex that matches username. And the benefit of that is if the content editor comes in and says, oh, we're going to change this to email, well, that actually changes the user's expectation. That breaks the application, right? And so I want my test to fail for that. Or if somebody comes in and adds another username field and it says their username or something, then yeah, your test could break in that scenario, and that would probably break the user's expectation as well. And so tying yourself as closely as possible to the user's expectation. The user doesn't care if it says your username or just simply username. All they care about is that it has the text username in it, and so that's what your test should do. Another thing that I've seen people do is they'll make their translation abstraction. When in tests, it will just render the translation key. And so like all of your tests, it's just rendering the key. And so you can select by key if you want to do it that way. And then you won't be getting much confidence that the translation or the content editors aren't mucking around with stuff, but you can at least verify that you're wiring things out properly. Because one of the benefits of selecting by a label, and one of the really awesome benefits that I've seen in developing this library in the way that I have, is that if your label is not properly wired up to the input, like you just have a label, you have an input, but there's actually nothing connecting those two, then you can't use get by label text, because you can get the label, but you can't get the input that's associated to it because it's not associated. And that's a huge benefit. I found a lot of people confused by that, and I say, oh, well, your application isn't accessible. Fix the accessibility, and then you can start testing properly. So that's actually a bug. And a lot of people are also like, well, I've got this orange box that the user needs to click on. How do I get that orange box? I don't want to use a data test ID. I say, well, does that orange box have a label? How does an end user know what that orange box is? Like, what if I'm blind? How do I know what that orange box is? Oh, well, okay, we need to add an ARIA label tag or have like an explicit label, and then we can find that element. And so, the way that React Testing Library interacts and queries around your elements encourages your application to be to resemble the way that users are using it, and in so doing, also make your application more accessible.
Yeah.
I want my screen reader just to say random orange box.
Yeah. Yeah. ARIA label equals random orange box.
I like this idea of having a different library, because usually we think that more powerful tools are better because we can do more. So like Enzyme is more powerful because you can do everything with Enzyme. But after spending a lot of time like studying these like strong typed languages, and they always talk about like making legal states not representable with the tests and stuff like that. So I think this is kind of the same thought process. It's like, when you use React Test Library, some things are like impossible to do. Like you cannot, of course, nothing's impossible with JavaScript, but it's like not out of the box that you can inspect the state of the component. So you're actually putting constraints. You made like a less powerful library. Correct me if I'm wrong. You made like a less powerful library, but what the library does is actually like a collection of best practice that you want to enforce. So it's like much easier. It's you can't is much stronger than you shouldn't. Does it make sense?
Yes, absolutely. You tie your hands to free your mind. And I think that's super true of this library. I'll amend what you said by saying it absolutely does less, but what it does better. And so with Enzyme, if you wanted to get an input by its label text, you'd have to write a whole bunch of code. They don't have something like that. But React Testing Library enables that, which makes writing the tests a lot easier. And in fact, for a very long time, people have said, TDD is the best, test-driven development, it's awesome. Oh, except for UI. Like, you can't test drive UI. That doesn't make any sense. I don't know what it's going to look like. Am I going to render a div or a span? I don't know. But whether you render a div or a span is an implementation detail. So if you can use a tool that doesn't allow you to test implementation details, or doesn't make it easy anyway, and your test is free of implementation details, now suddenly you can actually start using test-driven development. Well, I know I'm making a form, and I know it's going to have a username input, and I know it's going to have a password, and I know it's going to have a submit. So I can write that test, and then I can go implement it. And in testingjavascript.com, I do exactly that. And I've got like 8 videos in a row that show you the process of test driving a login form. Because now with React Testing Library, it's actually reasonably possible to use test-driven development to develop UI, which is pretty cool.
I imagine that in combination with Cypress too.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's one really nice thing about how easy Cypress is to use, and how great the developer experience is that before with Selenium, it was just such a pain to write and maintain Selenium tests that nobody test-driven development with Selenium was like, that's a total joke. Like, even just hearing those words together is hilarious. But in testingjavascript.com, I actually have a video where I show you how we can test drive or use Selenium as our test driver for implementing a new feature. So I called it Cypress-driven development. But today you're going to have your Chrome window, and you'll have your editor, and you'll make some changes in your editor. Then you'll refresh, and you'll navigate, click through, click. Yeah, exactly. Lucas is doing the click with me. But like that process is really frustrating. I know everybody has had that experience where you're making changes to this thing that's like 12 steps in through this form flow or whatever, and it's really frustrating. Well, you could write those 12 steps in Cypress first. And then, and Cypress will get you into that state. And then in Cypress, you can still like interact with the DOM and play around with things. And so Cypress can get you into the state every time you make a change really, really quickly. And so Cypress-driven development is a pretty awesome workflow. I haven't totally converted over to that, but I want to, because I think that it's a really good idea. Even if you don't end up committing those tests, like maybe they're not really useful. They're a workflow mechanism, and I think that's a pretty cool approach.
I just wrote a small library here at work to deal with metrics, and I 100% did that. NPM starts Storybook, starts Cypress, and you just start. And I was like automating all those small clicks that I usually do, like you. Write a little bit, click a little bit, write a little bit, click a little bit. No, just automate those clicks. And it was really good. I felt like an improvement in my efficiency that way. And those became the test. Like those 3 scenarios became the 3 integration tests for the library, and that was it.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
All right, so one last question that I have. So what about React Native? That's one of the biggest things that come up at Artsy because we do a lot of React Native stuff. So in looking at testing libraries, we always try to keep parity between the two, so there's not a whole lot of cognitive shift. So do you have any thoughts on that? Have you approached... I mean, I saw that there was like a clone of React Testing Library from CallStack that was like similar to React Library, but
yeah. So the tricky thing with I say that, hey, React Testing Library, free of implementation details. You can use DOM Testing Library to test any framework, except the problem is that React Native doesn't render to the DOM. It renders to a completely different target. And so that brings a tricky situation. So in React Testing Library documentation, there's an example of how you can mock out all of React Native's elements, like the view and whatever. And it works pretty well as long as you're not using navigation, apparently, in your tests. But lots of people are using navigation in their tests. So yeah, that's always been a little bit tricky. But I don't use React Native personally, so I wasn't going to work on solving this problem. So that's when CallStack built React Native Testing Library, and they talked with me about it, and I kind of helped give them some ideas and things, and they built React Native Testing Library. And that's what I recommend people using React Native use. it encapsulates lots of the same principles that I'm trying to accomplish with React Native Testing Library and the other testing libraries that I've created. They do a couple of extra things that are different from what we were doing in React Testing Library, but I feel pretty confident in what they're doing, and I think it's a good thing. So that's where I direct people to. And the nice thing is, when you get into this testing library community, you get pretty comfortable with how similar they are. Especially any of those that are based on DOM testing library, they're going to be very, very similar. All the queries are going to be the same. React testing library has a couple different queries, but you kind of get a handle on that pretty quick, I think. And yeah, hopefully that helps folks who are using React Native.
Cool, thanks.
Yep.
All right. I'm getting thumbs up from people. I don't feel that smart. Kent's the smart one. Anything else that we should jump on with this? I mean, it's fascinating just to dive in and talk about this. And I really, really love the idea of, essentially testing what's different about my app instead of the implementation details I pull in. So that's a powerful concept on its own. Plus, when we talk about confidence, I mean, that's really powerful too. Not just for, the idea of, hey, it works, but also I can move ahead and know that something's going to rear up and bite me if I do something wrong. So
I have one question that maybe could be a good last question. It's okay. So you come to work in this component. You need to solve a bug in this component. You never touched it before. Okay, and it has like 50 different tests that you see that 45 of them are like super like implementation tests that are not helping you at all. And then you start your PR with 50 tests and you end up with 7 tests. How do you deal with people in the teams? Everybody say like, are you deleting tests? Are you crazy?
Time to find a new job.
Yeah, I mean, you could show them the coverage report and say, oh, like those tests were not good. They were not helping. And we still have the same amount of coverage. And the new tests that I have here are will break less. Well, they'll break when they're not supposed to, or they won't break when they're supposed to not break, and they will break when they are supposed to break, I guess. You just send them one of my blog posts and then say merge this. That's one thing I failed to mention. I have testingjavascript.com where you can support my family and pay me some money to learn all about testing. But I have a huge amount of free content available on my blog and on my YouTube channel that you can go learn a lot about some of these ideas. So, and I also have a newsletter I send out weekly, not always about testing. Lots of times it's React or just JavaScript or Babel plugins or whatever. But you can find that at kcd.im/news. And like this last newsletter I sent out was like my final answer to why are implementation details so bad and what are they even. So it's pretty good size blog post. It'll hit my blog in a couple weeks. But yeah, just send them that and say, these were all implementation details tests. They're worthless. I rewrote these to be free of implementation details. We didn't need as many, which is typical. Like if you're testing implementation details, you generally need more. And if your test is free of implementation details, you generally don't need as many. So you say, yeah, I have fewer tests, but I still have the same amount of coverage, and these tests will break when they're supposed to.
Yeah, one other thing just to add on to what Kent said is that I am a big fan of trying something and seeing how it goes. And so you can also tell your teammates, look, and this is a principle of agile development, and I don't know if that'll help you or not, but essentially you can say, look, let's try this for a while. The old tests are still in the Git history, right? If we really want them back, we can get them. But for right now, let's see if this speeds up our tests, if it makes life a little bit better for us. And then, yeah, if we decide, you know what, those tests were playing a major role, or we feel like, one of them may have been deleted erroneously, then we go pull it out of the Git history and put it back in, and nobody's hurt by it.
Chuck, I love that so much. I've got an entire blog post about why you should never commit commented out code, because I might need it in the future. Because like we've got Git, friend, like we can go back and get stuff. If I totally agree. Let's try this out, see how we like it. We can always go back because Git is great.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is like Git history from the command line is sometimes tricky to deal with, but most people are committing to a GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, whatever. and you can search the code base in there. You can find exactly the commit you want to reverse, and you can just pull it back in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, life is great.
Everything is awesome.
Now I'm going to start singing. All right. Well,
Do it.
everything's okay. So let's go ahead and do some picks. Is your job search stuck? Maybe you're not getting any interviews with employers, or maybe you are, but no job offers. Or you may be new and not even know where to start. This is Charles Max Wood, and I'm releasing a new course and ebook on how to find a job as a software developer. The course walks you through the process of finding the types of companies you want to work for, getting their attention, and putting your best foot forward as the candidate they want. I've coached dozens of developers in looking for jobs and have been able to help several people find jobs within 2 weeks to 2 months. So whether you're new to development, can't find a great job that fits what you want, or are looking for remote work from an area without a strong tech community, I can help. Go to getacoderjob.com and sign up today. Lucas, you want to do some picks?
All right. I'm going to talk about a book I just bought. Like when I started thinking about planning more and I got into state machines and how to think about our products and our UI flows before actually starting to code. And one resource that I found, it was really good, was this blog by Hilo Wayne. He talks a lot about tools to help you with planning, even like proving stuff in your requirements. And I learned about this tool called TLA Plus in his blog, and I bought his book just released called Practical TLA Plus. I have no idea yet on how I'm going to use this on on real life, but it's one of those books and those ideas that make you think about stuff. So it is the amount of problems that you can solve before you start actually coding is amazing. So just knowing that these types of tools exist already, like spark stuff like in my mind, and I'm pretty sure it will be interesting to a lot of people.
Nice. Justin, what are your picks?
So I've got two. One is very in the weeds. So I do a lot of work on our continuous integration Circle CI builds at work. And I've been getting really in the weeds, trying to like parallelize everything. And I'm building a new release process around like, so we want to like ship a release every time a PR is merged. And that's been a really interesting endeavor, but there's this repo that I've discovered this week that's like been really awesome. So if you use Circle CI, one of the Circle engineers wrote this Circle CI job called Circle Queue. So it allows you to queue up jobs in your workflow. Hopefully this like makes it as like a Circle feature eventually. But so if you like want to, for our case, we want every master build to be queued up so they happen sequentially, and like a master build like builds and publishes before the next one runs. That way we're like, have sequential releases. It's a really, really useful thing. And also as a part of this, it kind of goes into my next pick. There is a Bash testing framework called BATS. So it's Bash Automated Testing System. So if you ever find yourself writing some really complicated Bash, use that. I actually found that example in that Circle library. So it blew my mind. Also, don't write complicated Bash if you can help.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. The last thing is I've been trying to get my life more organized, and I've used just tons and tons of to-do apps and to-do tools, and I'm still trying to find the right one. But I've been using Todoist lately, and it's worked out really well so far. The thing that I like most about it is it has an open API. So I've got just a lot of crazy integrations. I've got GitHub integrations and Jira integrations, and that's really helps kind of get all the tasks into the one place for me. So far, so good. If anybody else has any recommendations for good to do things, then let me know, because I'm always trying to stay on top of it. But that's my picks for this week.
Nice. That reminds me of a technique that I picked up out of a podcast I've been listening to. The podcast is called the MF CEO Project. MF stands for Mother Effing CEO. I try and keep a clean rating on here, so I'm not going to give you the full name, but I'm sure you can find it. If you just do a Google search for MF CEO, you'll find it. But anyway, one of the things that the host, Andy Frisella, said was to list the 5 things you need to get done today, and then just do them, right? And then you conquered your day. And I've really been doing that the last week and really been liking it. So I'm going to toss that out there as just kind of an interesting tip, I guess. And I'll pick the podcast as well. And then, I also just want to quickly pick the show. So if you go to thedevrev.com, that's where the podcast is at, The Developer Revolution. We're about developer freedom in all forms. And so I'll be talking a lot about different things there. I'll probably wind up having guests on, as just people that you've heard of from the programming community. But I am jazzed about it. I started to get kind of sad, bored, I don't know, over the summer. And then some of that I think was just due to some of the no fun crap that I went through at the beginning of the year. But I was thinking, why am I doing this? And then I realized that I do it because it helps people. And because it helps people find that fulfillment and that excitement and that freedom and that, in this industry, in this day and age, especially in the U.S. and other, well-off countries, I mean, there's no excuse for you to not be happy with, your job and where you're at and things like that. You may have to pay some dues and not have an ideal job for your first year or so. But after that, I mean, you should be able to find something that really lights you up. And so that's what I'm about. And so for some people, I talk to, Kent, it seems like teaching's a big part of that. I talk to some of the other folks out there, and open source contribution is a big part of it. Or, organizing conferences is a big part of it. Or just being able to work on cool stuff, and so they love their job because they work on cool stuff. So, I'm just like, if it fires you up, let's do it. So anyway, that's part of why I'm writing the How to Get a Job book. Again, is find the job that'll light you up, and here's how you get noticed. So anyway, I also encourage people to go find their why, right? I mean, and if your why or why you do things takes you into other fields, I mean, that's great too. So anyway, Kent, what are your picks?
All right, cool. I agree with finding your why. I'm going to repick that. Find your why. So I've got a couple other things. I'll just reiterate. I released testingjavascript.com. It is the most comprehensive, the biggest, best place for you to learn about testing on the internet. I feel very confident about that. And then I'm also going to pick my newsletter. I send weekly blog posts. It's like totally free and whatever. If you don't mind emails, you can also subscribe to the RSS feed. But you can find that at kcd.im/news. And 2 weeks after I post something to the newsletter, I stick it on my blog. So people who don't like email can still enjoy stuff later. So it's blog.kentsydodds.com. And then with all of this excitement about React hooks and React suspense coming soon to React, well, suspense is here, but mostly. I created a series about 30 minutes worth of Egghead videos. They're totally free. It's not a course or anything, but they're collected together in a playlist. You can find that at kcd.im/hooks-and-suspense. And it includes testing with hooks. And basically the reason I included testing with hooks was so I could show you that React testing library doesn't care. You can use hooks if you want. And then one last thing that's not programming related, but something I've been working on really heavily is this NaNoWriMo.org. That's National Novel Writing Month. It's the month of November. People of all over the world will spend the entire month writing 50,000 words for a novel. It's pretty fun. And we've got this, actually, I'll get a link to this Discord called Devs Who Write that I helped get started, where we talk about our work in writing our novels. Mine is like really jazzing me up. I've got like 13,000 words so far in this month. So I'm on track to write 50,000 words of a novel in the month of November. Super fun. It's fantasy. There's a really cool magic system and all that. And I have a link to the Google Doc in the Discord. So if you want to read my totally unedited NaNoWriMo novel, then you can go check it out on Discord. And that's it for me.
Nice. I definitely want to get in on that. Do you talk about nonfiction writing too, or is it all fiction writing?
We accept all writers. So yeah, if you want to do nonfiction, some people are in there not doing NaNoWriMo, just doing short stories and stuff. Whatever you want to chat about. We've got a channel for tools on becoming a better writer and just talking generally and all kinds of stuff.
Nice. All right, Kent. Well, I think you're fairly well known, but just for people who got their first introduction to you today, where do they find you online?
You can find me on Google. I use the C in my middle initial C to make me even easier to Google. So Kent C. Dodds. I'm Kent C. Dodds on Twitter, GitHub, everywhere. So you can find me anywhere.
All right. Well, thank you, Kent. That was awesome.
Thank you. I thought it was pretty fun too.
All right, folks. We will come back next week with another episode.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.